Margaret, why don't we get started here?
Sure.
Now that we're being recorded.
Yes.
Well, if no one from the managers at Chevalier is starting it, I can start it, and I will have to leave. But let me just begin by saying a little bit about Chevalier's, which I kind of already said to anyone listening. But Chevalier's is here, and we view ourselves as part of the community. We know that the way that independent bookstores survive is by being part of the community. And I say, and it may sound like a cliche and people are tired of hearing it, but I view Chevalier's as part of the intellectual infrastructure of Los Angeles. We're here for the people that want to come to our store and buy our books and talk to our excellent booksellers about what they need to buy. You know, when it comes to holiday season for me, and I need to buy for all my relatives back east, I go to the bookstore and talk to the booksellers. What do you have for this person who's my relative who likes these sets? What do you have for my aunt? What do you have, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of what we really do at Chevalier. So this session tonight fits into that whole framework. We're really excited to have David and Margaret with us tonight. I didn't know that you were originally from LA, so you're kind of back at home. It's too bad we're not all sitting around together at the. I did a session with Jon Taplin about a month ago on his book, and we had a great session inside the store. So that was a lot of fun. David and Margaret, thanks for coming with us. The book looks really exciting. It's an exciting topic. And Jon, I don't know if there's anyone better to talk about this. Jon lived through it. I lived through it. Jon's even older than I, apparently. And you said you were, so I believe it. So you know, we're going to kind of go into this really interesting time machine, I think. Go back to this period of time when, you know, revolution was in the air. And, you know, it was I remember being reluctantly drawn into it because I just wanted to go to college, and I was the first one in my family to be able to go, and I was working about 30 hours a week. But finally, I couldn't hold off any longer, and I became a member of SDS, and pretty soon ended up leading it on the chapter at my campus, and learned a lot about the movement in Minneapolis before I went to Madison to do my graduate work. So we're really excited to have Jon and Margaret and David with us tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Jon. I know he can do a great job of running the meeting tonight, and I'm really excited to hear how it all goes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daryl. It's great to be back with Chevaliers. Here's the book. It's a beautiful book. You know, there's a lot of books about the 60s. I've read a lot of books about the 60s. I've even written a couple of books about the 60s. Yes. But I was surprised at how much I learned. I thought I knew everything about the 60s, but I really learned a lot from this book. And some of the chapters I knew nothing about. Some of the chapters I thought I knew a lot about. It turned out I didn't. So my hat is off to Margaret and David. And I guess I should say, we have a long history together. The first job I ever had was teaching at UC Santa Cruz in 1973. And one of the first people I met there was David Talbot, who was a SDS activist, undergraduate. He had a fantastic group of activist friends, and I got to know all of them. And that quarter, the students were on strike almost the entire 10 weeks. So it was a very interesting way to start my career in academia, really unforgettable. And then Margaret, who's younger, I guess we should say, Margaret was my editor at a wonderful magazine in the, 70s and 80s, Lingua Franca, the late lamented Lingua Franca. Some of the best writers we have today wrote for Lingua Franca and edited at Lingua Franca, and I still miss it. And I'm still friends with a lot of the people who I met through Margaret and Lingua Franca. So, By the Light of Burning Dreams, The Triumph and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution. This book focuses on a lot of familiar names from the 60s. Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. You open your book with Tom Hayden, which is kind of a gutsy move since a lot of people think they know all about Tom Hayden. I was one of those people. But there's an argument here about Tom Hayden that I thought was completely eye-opening, and it really goes a lot to explain his whole life. You say that really the turning point of his life came right after the Chicago conspiracy trial, where he had been convicted and was facing 5 years in a federal prison. He moved to Berkeley. He he helped found a commune, the Red Family, a famous group. And you argue that the turning point in his young life came in 1971 when he was kicked out of the Red Family commune in Berkeley. Tell us what that was about and why it was so important in his life.
Yeah, well, thank you, John. I'll take that one since I mostly wrote that one. Margaret and I think, worked very well together, kind of a good brother-sister act. But I knew Tom, not as well as many, but I was a foot soldier in the anti-war movement. I lived in Venice Beach for a while when Tom and Jane Fonda were still fighting against the war in Vietnam, and running the Indochina Peace Campaign and later the Campaign for Economic Democracy. So I thought always Tom was a fascinating figure. To me, he was actually the best strategist and political thinker on a leadership level who I came across from the New Left in those days, the early 70s. And so I followed Tom off and on throughout the years. I edited Tom later when I became an editor, a magazine editor, and I got to know him as a legislator when he worked up in Sacramento in California. And I always thought his story was emblematic of the anti-war movement in many ways. He grew up in the Midwest. I think he was disowned twice, once by his own father, who was a very tough World War II veteran, Irish Catholic, a drinker, and couldn't abide Tom, couldn't believe that his young son, his only son, had turned into a new left icon. And then later, as you say, John, he was ejected from his other home, really a more important home in some ways, his home on the left, the New Left, the Red Family commune in Berkeley, because in large part, he'd become a celebrity. And at that point, the women's movement, which was on the rise, and the radical movement in general, distrusted celebrities. He came out of the Chicago 8 trial as a celebrity. He was on TV every night. He and the other members of the Chicago 8, Bobby Seale, Abby Hoffman, and so on, were celebrities. Aaron Sorkin just celebrated them in his movie, which I thought was not very good. In any case, Tom had to reinvent himself then. He had been not only excommunicated from the Red Family, but from all of Berkeley, and by extension, from the left in general. And he really went through a long, I think, night of the soul. He had a nervous breakdown. He moved to Los Angeles. He reinvented himself. He met Jane Fonda. And I think he deserves more credit than he does. He could have skulked away like a lot of New Left leaders at that point, disappeared into the mist of time. But he reinvents himself as a leader of the anti-war movement again, and he decides that the anti-war movement had become too radical, too extreme in many ways, too militant, and he wanted to reach out to heartland America, to church groups, to labor groups, to even Republican groups, and he did very successfully, he and Jane Fonda, organizing the Indochina Peace Campaign. He successfully, I think, through these efforts, succeeded in cutting off congressional funding to the war in Vietnam in 1975, and I think helped bring about the end of that war, which of course many people to this day, the liberal elites and so on, the media, tend to say the anti-war movement had no impact on the war. I think that's very wrong. It's historically inaccurate. I think Tom Hayden deserves a lot of credit for what he was able to accomplish.
And I have one other question about your Tom Hayden chapter. Tom, of course, famously went into electoral politics, got elected to the legislature, served for decades with great distinction, was very proud of it. It all started in 1976 when he ran in the Democratic primary against the incumbent Democratic senator, kind of a centrist conservative named John Tunney. Big challenge to the Democratic Party establishment, and he lost. It was a memorable campaign for those of us who were in California in 1976, but he lost. He went on to win, I don't know, a dozen other campaigns, but you say that campaign, you say, was the high point of his life in Democratic politics, and he sort of drifted downhill after that. That's a very unusual way of understanding Tom's life in electoral politics. What do you mean?
Well, it was only the high point in the sense that he came close, and I think ran a very vigorous campaign for the U.S. Senate. After that, he readjusted his sights and became a very successful, I think, in many ways, given the fact that Republicans were in charge of the governor's office for most of the time that Tom served in the California state legislature. But given that, I think he actually put together a very successful career as a state legislator, but he lowered his sights to do that. And I think Tom originally thought he could have been a president, the first president produced by the New Left. And I think in other countries where they didn't have such a strong anti-communist, anti-left bias, Tom would have gone much higher politically. And I think that's actually more of a comment on America and our own political limitations than it is on Tom. Tom had his flaws, and we write about that. Margaret and I are very, I think, honest about acknowledging the flaws of these leaders of the New Left. He was a big drinker, a womanizer, and so on. But I think he was a brilliant strategist. And I think he was right to go into electoral politics. He got a lot of shit for it from the left, from other radicals who felt he was selling out. That's not selling out. It took Bernie Sanders decades to revive the same themes that Tom ran on back in 1976. He was running on the Green New Deal, essentially. When he said economic democracy, that was socialism by any other name. He was
yes. When Tom, excuse me, but if you don't mind, I mean, when Tom he organized the CED, that was a really interesting and important movement. That was a very important in the movement, because the movement was learning how to grow up and how you had to be more involved in the electoral arena in order to get anything done. And he laid the groundwork for that. I was at that time in Milwaukee running progressive campaigns, and we looked at the CED as something that we could go by. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about the last time I ever saw Tom. I was I went over to the Figueroa Hotel, which is across the street from where my office is, and I was writing a lecture. I had to give a lecture. I was giving a lecture at USC on students in the left in the 60s. And I took my old copy of the Port Huron statement that I had from 1962. And I'm sitting there up there in this, hardly anyone went to the hotel at that time. I had a little desk or a little seat that the owner would always let me sit at, and no one was around. And I was there after work, and I was reading the Port Huron statement and writing this lecture. And all of a sudden, I'm up in the mezzanine, and I hear someone say, "Hey, is the bar open up here?" And I said, "No, the bar is not open up here unless the bar is open downstairs. It's only up here when they're doing a private party." And I turn around and I look at this person, and it's Tom Hayden.
Wow.
And I say, "Tom, come here. Look at what I'm reading." He looked at it. It's my old copy of Port Huron State with all my markings in it. He said, "Hey, come on downstairs and have a beer with me." We went down, we had a great talk. And then at the end of the talk, it was so interesting. At the end of the talk, he takes me out to his car. He said, "You've got to come out to my car." He opens up the trunk. He pulls out a copy of a new copy of the Port Huron Statement and a couple of other books that he gives me. And he says, you got to take these. I said, "You're taking these things out of the trunk just like I used to do in SDS when my trunk was always full of SDS literature." It was this incredible moment, and it was the last time I ever saw him.
Wow, that's a great story.
Yeah, I think Tom walked the walk until the day he died. He was a great guy. I was very fond of him. So, John, going back to your original question, and then we can shift gears. But yeah, no, I don't think Tom sold out. I don't think he gave in. I don't think he was he always had a high vision for what the left should do and how the left should have an impact on this country. And as Todd Gitlin, another former SDS president, told me at Tom's memorial, the problem is with the left. It's not with, some of the people we talk about, like Tom Hayden. The left had Occupy. We were not able to utilize Occupy in the way that the right wing did with the Tea Party, as Todd Gitlin pointed out to me. The Tea Party elected right-wing people, Republicans, to the Senate, to the House, and we didn't have the same electoral vision on the left. Tom did, till the day he died.
I agree completely. So a lot of people, including me, thought we knew a lot about Tom Hayden. I didn't really know anything about the Jane Collective, founded in Chicago by Heather Booth. You call it one of the most remarkable feats of grassroots activism and sheer chutzpah in the history of American feminism. Please explain the Jane Collective.
Sure. Yeah, the Jane Collective, I think is a remarkable story. I don't know how many people here might be familiar with it at all, but yes, it started in Chicago in the mid 1960s when abortion was illegal across the country. It ended in 1973 when Roe v. Wade legalized abortion throughout the country. And it was basically an underground abortion service where women, mostly students at the University of Chicago, but also young faculty wives and others in the community who were feminists and involved in the women's liberation movement, came together and taught themselves, first with the help of doctors and other medical professionals, and then on their own, to perform abortions, which they did, in secrecy, but with a very feminist agenda, talking to women about reproductive rights, about birth control. They ended up providing almost 10,000 abortions, maybe more. They had a very good safety record. They originally saw a lot of students who had become unintentionally pregnant, but they also began to see, as part of their their clientele, part of the people they served, wives, girlfriends, daughters of Chicago cops, a lot of Black women, a lot of low-income women. Yes, as you say, it was founded by a woman named Heather Booth, who is a kind of recurrent character in our book, but particularly in that chapter. She is a remarkable organizer, now in her 80s, I believe, and still at it. But at the time, she was an undergrad at the University of Chicago who had gone to Mississippi for Freedom Summer and been very radicalized by that experience, and very kind of alert to the idea that there were times when you had to break the law if it was unjust. And so she had a friend whose sister was pregnant and desperate not to be, and got a call from that friend who said, "Can you help my sister?" She really had no idea. She knew nothing about the underground abortion world, but she decided she was going to help this woman, and she did. So she started it first as a referral service out of her dorm. Women would call and ask for Jane, and built it out from there with the help of other Chicago feminists into this, as I say, feminist-led, feminist-informed underground abortion service with a remarkable record. So very relevant today as we think about the possibility that Roe v. Wade may be overturned.
And let me just remind our viewers that Margaret Talbot has written two wonderful pieces about the politics of abortion recently in the New Yorker, one about the real Jane Doe and one about the Mississippi case that's going to be what may be the end of Roe v. Wade, or maybe not, sort of depending on John Roberts. So you can read Margaret in the New Yorker, find out all about it. I also love the chapter you guys wrote on the American Indian movement, another one of the lesser known parts of the history of the 60s and the early 70s, the American Indian movement at Wounded Knee. Russell Banks, Madonna Thunderhawk, Russell Means. This is the story of what happened at Pine Ridge Reservation in 1973.
Yeah, no, that was a dramatic story, very dramatic. And the 71-day siege. The members of the American Indian movement, which had been kind of inspired by the Black Panthers, Dennis Banks, Russell Means, Madonna Thunderhawk, and people who lived on that reservation who felt they just had it. The administration was brutal and corrupt. They appealed to the federal government. They got no help there. Of course, the long years of federal betrayal of American Indians. And so they took a stand. As you say, in 1973, about 200 men, women, and children occupied this kind of spiritual site, the site of an earlier massacre of a Lakota people by George Custer's regiment. And they were exacting revenge for Custer's last stand on these peaceful Indians, some 200 massacred in 1890s by members of Custer's regiment. So in occupying the site in 1973, it was kind of a rekindling of the past as well. And they were immediately surrounded by federal marshals, FBI, militarized police. I was at Standing Rock a few years ago, and it was very similar, except more brutal, I think, back in 73. It lasted for 71 days. They tried to starve them out. There was the kids there were actually suffering from malnutrition. Bill Zimmerman, another hero in our book, led a convoy of small airplanes over Wounded Knee and dropped food supplies to the people there. They claimed, the federal marshals and the FBI, that there were guns. There weren't guns in those relief packages. It was just food. But that produced another huge fusillade. Some 500,000 rounds of ammunition fired into this small outpost of men, women, and children who basically just had a few rifles among them to resist these federal forces. So last night I tell the story, I interviewed Dennis shortly before he died, Dennis Banks. I interviewed Lenny Foster, who was a young Navajo at the time, who led Dennis out through this tight armored circle around them, armored cars like in Vietnam, infrared technology, Vietnam War technology, all surrounding them. But miraculously, Dennis Banks escaped that night and lived to fight another day, which frankly, that's what Madonna Thunderhawk and many other Indian militants who were involved in that stand told me, that living to fight another day is victory for them. And Dennis, of course, went on to have a very long, illustrious life as a leader of the American Indian movement.
You know, if you don't mind, you know, I knew of Dennis and Russell before that in 1970 and 71 with SDS, and I connected with them in Minneapolis. And the American Indian movement, I grew up in that Indian neighborhood in Minneapolis, which was the largest urban center of Native Americans, I think, in America. And you know, I recall when we first made connections with them, and we talked about what we were doing in SDS, and we were trying to build these coalitions. And Russell Means and Dennis Banks were really interesting to work with, but Russell was they were different in their political philosophies, even at that time, which I think is important to what we're concerned about here. Russell was very open to uniting with other groups in a multiracial kind of strategy and a class-based kind of approach, whereas Dennis was moving very distinct. I mean, you could see it happening towards a more of a nationalist position, and the two of them would disagree with us when we had meetings. Sometimes, you know, you would see this happen. So that was really an interesting thing for me in that period in 1971. But, you know, before the American Indian movement, I mean, that's really when it started, and it was really interesting to see it as it developed in Minneapolis.
But unlike, say, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers, who were divided, who were very different in their outlooks and their personalities, and I think the pressure from the FBI and the police on the Black Panthers did divide some very violent schisms between people. I think Dennis and Russell, till the day they died, till the day Russell died, actually worked out an interesting partnership. And Dennis talked about that with me. Russell was often the hot-headed one, the militant one. He would go before the cameras and say things that, were pretty violent sometimes. And Dennis was kind of the more diplomatic one. They played those roles out together. But by the end of their lives, both men had come around to, I think, embrace a peaceful strategy for change. Even Russell Means wrote in his book, his memoir, that he believed that peaceful resistance was the only way to get true change effected in America. And Dennis went to Standing Rock, which had a very nonviolent ethos. I was there. It was run in many respects by women who were members of various tribes, including the tribe was affected by the oil pipeline. And, there were no guns. They searched you for guns when you went in, unlike Wounded Knee. And the whole kind of vibe was about peace and peaceful resistance, no matter how violent, and there was pretty violent, law enforcement officials were around Standing Rock, hitting people, shooting rubber bullets at them, beating them, and so forth. So it's peaceful resistance. And I think Margaret and I do agree with this, that we understand why the Black Panthers use guns as a form of really political theater to confront violent cops on the streets of Oakland. And we understand why the American Indians used guns to defend themselves, only in defense, at Wounded Knee. But in the end, when you bring guns into a situation, it's it is always more than just theater. It produces a kind of, I think, violent counter assault that is too hard for resistance movements to deal with. So I think they came around to the right, conclusion at the end of their lives.
So we've been talking about the heroes of the 60s, Tom Hayden, Heather Booth, Russell Means, Dennis Banks. One of the best things about this book is that you don't just look at the heroes. You talk about the problems and frankly the disasters around the 60s and some of its leaders. And maybe number one on my list is Huey Newton. One of the big themes of the 60s was Free Huey. A lot of us went to rallies and shouted Free Huey many times. What happened to Huey Newton? How do you understand the, what shall we call it, devolution of Huey Newton into crime and, a kind of madness, I guess?
Well, it was always the Huey and Bobby show. It was Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. And Bobby was the older one, the one who'd been in the Air Force, was more disciplined, was more, I think, emotionally stable and more of the leader. And as Bobby tells it today, that Huey was the tiger that he brought into the room to kind of electrify people. But Huey Newton was a brilliant guy. He was brilliant, charismatic, and courageous. And Bobby would say that. And believe me, the two of them had a very violent falling out at the end. So Bobby has every reason now, as an older man, to be very critical of Huey. But he gives him his due. Huey was the guy, and Bobby acted this whole thing out for me, who went on the streets in a very disciplined way, 12 Black Panthers who confronted an Oakland cop for the first time. The Oakland cops had a habit of shaking down law-abiding Black citizens in one of the entertainment districts of Oakland every weekend, just because they could. It was a show of brute force and racist brute force. And so the Black Panthers, who were newly founded, decided this isn't going to happen anymore in our neighborhood. So they went with guns. They'd read the law books. Huey Newton was in law school at the time and confronted these cops. I think Huey got off on that, though. Bobby Seale's intention was to pivot from guns and that kind of political street theater to electoral strategy. And Bobby himself ran for mayor of Oakland in 1973. So he was on Tom Hayden's kind of, I think, same trajectory. I think Huey was different. He was both more mercurial and more temperamental than Bobby by nature. And I think they fucked with him in prison.
Yeah.
He did go to prison for years. He was put in solitary. God knows what they did. I interviewed people who knew Huey before he went to jail and after, and said it wasn't the same man who came out. I think they drugged him. I think they fucked with him in all sorts of ways. And he was a very paranoid, even crazier guy when he came out. And then the FBI continued to harass him. You know, the COINTEL program, which Margaret and I write about a lot in this book, was a major factor in the 60s. They had infiltrators. They tried to provoke violent kind of feuds between radical groups, and they did successfully. So, you know, you can't separate Huey's devolution, as you say, John, from the kind of constant police harassment that he was undergoing and whatever they did to him in prison. But yes, he had his own demons. And what he did was descend into drugs. He basically turned the Panthers into a street gang. They were, you know, it was turf battles with other people for the drug traffic. And he ended up being shot by a young gunslinger, a drug dealer on the streets of Oakland in his mid 40s, I think. So, you know, that is one of the sadder tales of the radical left in America.
And another one of the fascinating juxtapositions is Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Cesar Chavez ended up a very kind of a paranoid and dictatorial figure. Dolores Huerta remains a, you know, inspiring figure to millions of people. How do you explain what happened in that trajectory?
I don't know, David, if you want to add to this, but that is really, I think, a story partly about, you know, it's called the Martyr Complex, and a lot of it is about is focused on the hunger strikes that Chavez went on, which were actually very effective in terms of bringing attention to the farm workers' struggles. You know, along with the boycott strategies and other labor organizing tactics, but the hunger strikes were very powerful. But I think they do seem to have, many people who've written about Chavez have pointed this out. I mean, they do seem to have fueled this kind of feeling he had about himself as a kind of martyr, as a kind of saint, and that can be dangerous. And that's true. You know, you see that in a lot of movements, and that kind of charisma, which is so can be so motivating and galvanizing, but also can you know, lead to some very strange excesses. And he, among other things, got into this kind of Synanon fueled means of kind of breaking people down and you know, workshopping their psyches that was very damaging towards the end of his life, and towards, you know, people who had been close to him were very, very alienated by that. And I think Dolores Huerta, although they remained very close and you know, had frequent fallings out, and then she would come back to work with him again. I think at times she regretted perhaps not having, you know, prevented him from going down that path.
I think, John, that's a key element, a theme of our book, is that leaders are important to any movement. And that is not a particularly popular idea today. I think there's a whole kind of new attitude. I saw this at Occupy at Zuccotti Park the first weekend when I was there, flattening, you know, organization, not having any hierarchies at all, and so on, and not trusting leaders. And even in the 60s, we remember, John, that Dylan saying, you know, don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. So there was a kind of skepticism and cynicism even about leaders back then, in our day too. But I think the lesson of our book should not be that we don't need leaders. We do need leaders. I think for movements to sustain themselves, to be disciplined, to have vision, you need leadership. But the leadership has to be accountable. And the leadership has to be, you know, structurally sound, basically. And you need leaders to be tied in to the movements. And not get too far out there like Cesar Chavez did with the United Farm Workers. There has to be people who can can tell you when you're wrong, when you're off. You know, a couple other my books were about the Kennedy brothers, JFK and Bobby Kennedy. And not only were they a close team, but they had a brain trust around them, as most effective leaders do, who would bravely tell them, courageously tell them, look, you know, this is wrong. It's the wrong strategy. It's the wrong tactic. So you have to be, I think, a movement. The healthiest movements are ones that have leadership, that have vision, that have discipline, but also where the leaders are accountable.
Well, we want to hear questions if our audience wants to ask our authors anything. Sion, how are we going to handle questions? Are you going to do this, or I don't?
There's Sion.
Sion, come back. Tell us what to
Sorry,
do next.
I've been
Lead us, Sion. We need your leadership.
Yes, I have been posting in the chat to see if anybody had any questions. We were hoping that people would type some out, but also if people want to, I guess you can't raise their hand in this, but if you want to just come on and turn your video on and ask a question, that is also very acceptable.
Don't be shy.
People are so shy.
Well, let me ask just a couple of brief questions about the work on this book. Your personal engagement with this material, David. I know that you were a young activist in the 60s. I saw you in the streets of San Francisco. So, although most of the people you're writing about are several years older than you here, this is a book in part about your own young life, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I was inspired to write this book in some way, John, because it was like coming full circle. And I'm 70, I just turned 70. So I wanted to try to make sense of this history that I lived through, this tumultuous period. I wrote a book called Season of the Witch about San Francisco, similar book about the liberation of San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. I feel, I have to say, looking back at this age, you know, more, I think, in some ways pessimistic about what we were attempting and what we've accomplished. I feel that we had a huge impact on this country, and we were hugely successful when it comes to cultural and social kind of issues. And America today, as you know, John, is a very different place, and Margaret too, all of us, than it was when we were growing up in it. And culturally and socially, it's not even recognizable. It's the same country in many ways. And that's all for the better, I think. More diverse, more free, and more, you know, liberated in many ways. And yet, look, we had Donald Trump as the president for 4 years instead of Bernie Sanders. And now we have, you know, a Washington class that seems completely unable to deliver on basic sort of legislation that can make us a civilized society. We're mired in political, I think, and structural sort of malaise. So, you know, looking back on it, I think you have to say we had mixed success. So my book, the book that I did with Margaret and with Art, by the way, Art Allen, her husband, who's a great writer, who did the chapter on the farm workers. It was a collective enterprise. I feel in some ways is some kind of attempt to make sense of this history and to say where we went wrong and what we did wrong and what a younger generation of activists can learn from it. Do they give a damn? I don't know. You know, but we threw it out there. That's all we can do as writers, as journalists, Margaret and I, you know, we talked to people and we wrote as intelligently and as creatively as we could. And, you know, these books have ripple effects. I don't even know if we're a literary culture anymore sometimes. I love to hear the stories about independent bookstores like Chevalier's, that there are still oases of learning and culture that are out there. And thank God they still exist. And we'll keep writing as long as we live, I guess, Margaret and I, and you will too, John, I imagine. But, you know, you do wonder at the end of the day, at the end of your life, whether you've had much impact. So this was, not to be too morbid, an effort to come to some historical understanding about this and what we can learn moving forward.
And Margaret, your engagement with this is different. You're really too young to have been part of the 60s. This was something that your older brothers and sister were part of. It. What's it like as the kind of the younger sister to be writing about this?
I know, John, I'm glad you brought this up. I'm a mere child, really. And but I am brimming with youth. But no, I am 10 years younger than David. So I turned 60 this month and he turned 70. And so, yeah, so although that now we seem to be basically the same age, when you're younger, when I was, 8 and he was 18, that was a big difference. So yes, yeah. So I was the youngest and I had these, our oldest brother was a student at Wesleyan and a leader of SDS there. And then David and Cindy, our sister, who's now a doctor, were at Santa Cruz, and they were, on strike all the time and, in the streets. And Cindy was helping found the Santa Cruz Women's Health Collective. And so it was tremendously exciting to me. And I always felt, frustrated to be kind of not quite old enough to fully participate. So for me, it was really, actually, I guess, inspiring, and maybe I take David's points about the state of our current society and culture, but I did find this inspiring to write. I found the creation of some of these alternative institutions, whether it was the Panthers with their free breakfast program, or the Jane Collective with the underground abortion service, or the chapter we have on the gay liberation movement with Craig Rodwell founding the first gay bookstore in the world, the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop as a place where people could gather and plan and organize and also read and learn. I felt like that was that sense of the capacity to create these alternative institutions, this counterculture that was from the ground up, not something that was sold to people, by companies, was to me very exhilarating to go deeper into that history and find out about some of these experiments of the past, of the 60s.
Thank you for that. I want to say, Marcus, you turned your video on. Do you have a question you want to say? No.
Well, then let me ask.
We have some questions.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just enjoying the dialogue. I haven't read the book yet. I'm going to get a copy soon. I probably have some later though. So
okay, thank you.
Keep communicating. I studied the subject when I was going to college like you. I'm only 59, so it was very
You're
fascinating.
A baby.
Yes, of course.
Well, we appreciate the bravery of bringing your video on.
Yeah, and the period. Well, the only reason I didn't turn the video on is because sometimes the technology is a little ahead of where I am. So I didn't know how to turn the video on.
Well, it's nice to see your face.
You don't so alone.
Yeah, so a student of the period. Certainly, I communicate with Bobby Seale every once in a while. My father and mother were, active, but a little bit older. And, we were affected by everything that happened. And I'm, like I said, I'm going to get the book definitely to sit down and read as I'm looking into the later period, going into the 70s. And, a lot of what happened in the 1960s movements I'm realizing as I'm looking back, how it affected my life and how I approach the things that I do now.
Yeah, well, I should say I know Marcus a little bit. Marcus comes from an illustrious family here in the Bay Area. His father was the first African-American police chief of here in San Francisco. And Marcus himself is an interesting activist, a lawyer, and someone who's doing a lot of interesting environmental things today, if I understand correctly, Marcus, right?
Yeah. we're actually using a very interesting relationship with the Native American tribes. That's why I was very fascinated with the section on the Native American movement, which is now beginning to talk, well, has been talking and formulated into the, move towards the idea of sovereignty. And using the tribal relationships to be able to participate in environmental projects, solar energy, and building large solar facilities throughout the United States. It has been a challenge, but we are now starting to make headway with the new administration in place, and people realizing that climate change is real.
Yeah.
It's helped out a lot.
I think that would be so revolutionary to think of Indian reservations not as sources of coal and uranium, but as
Yes.
alternative energy, because they've been basically exploited for decades by big energy interests. And so,
Well, I've
yeah,
actually, since I've been involved in this, I've watched the evolution on Navajo, in the Navajo Nation with regards to closing major coal generation, electricity generation plant. And, we had huge debates during that period of time, this impact on the tribe in terms of selling the coal, the jobs that you would lose, but the impact on the reservation itself was devastating in terms of people's health, and it wasn't really delivering anything economically to the communities that were there. Solar will help. It'll have a cleaner output, and in storage is now giving more hope. Still very difficult to deal with the internal political processes. A lot of people have tried to working with us. We had to educate in terms of how the tribes function. Right now, our biggest focus is not necessarily, we decided to shelve Navajo for a moment, and we're focusing in the state of California, which has a very unique Native American relationship. And we were really concerned about moving away from the concept of the casinos, because that's what you would hear from the financial community. Making partnerships with them has always been is a challenge as well, because here you are selling them on the idea. I remember early on now, about 6-7 years ago, when I first started talking about this, and you would get, we don't want to invest in the Indians. You go, whoa, wait. And getting large financial organizations to say that, the tribes had to be partners in the resulting facilities that are being built, in the ownership of those facilities and the management of those facilities. So it's been an interesting journey. So listening to that, the other part that I'm going to really delve into in your book is the Black Panthers. It was coming from an African American standpoint at that time in my household. I had a mother who was an early anti-war activist. My father was in the military, so bring
the war home.
Yeah.
Yeah, the war. Yeah, it was interesting. I being younger, my biggest challenge was that my mother kept saying, "I'm going to send you to Canada. If the war is still going, you will not be drafted." So there was a certain relief when I was around 10 years old that we were leaving Vietnam, because I was doing research on Canada at 10.
Marcus, I think what was so interesting about the 60s was that you had that revolution at home too.
Yeah.
Much more. Much more than our sons say today. And I know your sons.
Yeah.
And,
the interesting phenomenon that I always remember is my mother took me to Houston, Texas to visit her parents in 1968, 67, 68, as I recall. It was my first airline flight. And we went to East Texas where she was born. And she and my grandfather had just, out and out argument. I always remember it because he would dip snuff and it looked like the dirt near where he was at. And I got so angry that I, filled a canister with dirt And then later I took my grandmother had me take a nap. And my grandfather realized while I was taking a nap that I had taken his snuff and turned it into dirt. But the fight was about her activities against the war.
Right.
And he was, he had sent, one of my older uncles had gone to Korea, and he was, at that time still very much in support of the war, even though there were changes in the African American community about the war.
Yeah.
And to hear my mother and my grandfather have a out and out argument. I think she went and got in her car, and drove off, and that's how angry she had gotten. But we did have that challenge. My mother used to say, here's my husband who's an officer. My dad was an officer in the Army, but he had avoided going to Vietnam, from talking to some of his friends who had gone and came back. And then we had family members who had been drafted and had come back, and the dissolution was you watched it change. So it's quite interesting. And
I think the war in Vietnam, people don't realize today, because war seems more remote. Afghanistan, the New York Times tried to gin up a lot of, kind of anger about the way we got out of there. Finally, President Biden. But I think people don't give a damn about the way that wars are fought. Young people had skin in the game. We all could be drafted. Young men could be drafted.
Right.
And, fueled, of course, the anti-war movement. So your mother's telling you to go to Canada. I mean, you really had to think about where you were going to do: go to jail, or go to Canada, or go to Vietnam. I become friends with Oliver Stone over the years, the director, and Oliver was one of the young men who went to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I think to this day, it scars him. He killed people. He got shot and wounded. So I think that war, people forget what a big shadow that was over all of us who were young at the time, because it kept grinding on and on, killing more and more people. It was so bloody. We saw on TV every night. And, I think a lot of us felt just a huge fury and anger that this war was being done in our name, and that we could go or be forced to go, or go to jail, or go underground. So, that's another, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
See you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
Marcus,
I said, this had a lot of impact on me, so I'm going to listen.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank
It's
you.
been great to hear your experiences with that. Before we close out, we do have a few questions that we got in the chat. So one from Renee is, do you have any new books planned?
Margaret.
Good, Margaret. I don't at the moment. My main job is I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker, so I have a lot of our contracts are by the word there, so you have a certain number of words you have to write every year. So I stay pretty busy with that, and I'm really trying to follow some of the issues like the abortion issue and others pretty closely next year. So I think I'm mainly going to be doing my day job at the New Yorker.
Had a good one.
What about you? Thank you.
Well, the last thing on my bucket list, I don't want to write another big history book. I'll leave that to Jon and Margaret. It's a real slog to write these kind of books, I have to say. And I kind of left it all in the field. But I'd love to actually turn one of my books into a screen product of some sort, either a TV series or a movie. And my son, I'll give a plug for my son, someone who Margaret was very close to as a devoted aunt. Joe Talbot made The Last Black Man in San Francisco, a great film. And so I love watching what he's doing now in film and what you can do through that medium. Very interesting, the music, the kind of dialogue, the kind of dream-like state that good films put you in. Very interesting to me. So that's my last dream, to turn one of my books into a movie.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We do have another question from Paul. So you mentioned before, David, that we have seen like a major positive change overall in the US. Paul is wondering like how that might change a little bit if we're looking at just California, if it would change at all. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm very active in politics in San Francisco, so I know a lot about politics here. And of course, I think there's been a big step backwards since the period of time I wrote about in Season of the Witch. I think when big tech invaded San Francisco, starting with the Twitter tax break, big milestone that invited a lot of companies to come into San Francisco without building housing for all the workers. A lot of people were evicted from their homes. A lot of people ended up on the streets. So you had this huge wealth gap between the tech sort of elite and the rest of San Francisco. I think it's the biggest wealth gap in the country now. So, you know, there's a lot to do in terms of housing, in terms of basic community services here in San Francisco. I know that's true in California as well. I know a lot of people don't think much of Gavin on the left, Gavin Newsom, our governor. And yet, I think the recall, defeating the recall as he did, was very important. I think that, you know, we're often politically in the situation of fighting for the lesser of two evils. That's just the nature of politics. And Gavin, I think, has done a lot of good things and deserved to win that recall campaign. And he did, of course, decisively. So, you know, as I look at California, I guess I'm more Californian than American in some ways. The values that we have in the state, you know, on the environment, on the criminal justice, and so on, I think are the values I want to live by, and this is more the world I want to inhabit. Despite the wildfires, despite all the things that Jon and I have written about in our books, the dystopias in Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's still, I think, closer to the kind of society that I want to live in. I have to say, I look at the rest of America, I look at the kind of red America and the kind of battles that they really animate them, whether it's abortion or, you know, COVID vaccinations. I just don't understand them. They just seem like a bizarre, you know, group of humanity to me. I don't get them. I don't get the rest of America. So, you know, I'm happier, I have to say, living among my own here in California.
Can I just put in a good word for California? I'm a little more optimistic than David is about this. San Francisco and Los Angeles have pioneered progressive district attorneys who are transforming criminal justice in our cities. Gavin Newsom just signed a slate of police reform measures which will apply everywhere in California. The kind of thing that came out of the Black Lives Matter protests of a year and a half ago took a little longer than it should have, but chokeholds are going to be barred. Bad cops are going to lose their badges, not be able to go to other departments. All kinds of restrictions on police abuse of power and citizens' power to stop police abuse of power. California, of course, has the most progressive state income tax anywhere in the United States. We've successfully fought COVID better than a lot of other places. So in many ways, California is the good United States. It's also true in all the cities of the United States are blue, have Democratic majorities. You know, it's the places in the middle that are what shall we say, the problem for us.
Yeah,
Yes.
and Jason Boudin, as you say, Jon, very progressive DA here in San Francisco, and he's the target of a recall campaign as well. So we're organizing to defeat that also. Cheza, a young progressive guy, is really trying to, I think, enact a lot of criminal justice reforms that are alienating, you know, the people you think would be alienated, the police force, the police unions, and so on. So yes, I think California is a laboratory for change still, and God bless our state.
Absolutely. And on that note,
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good note to say thank y'all so much for coming out tonight, Jon, Margaret, David. We have another note from Doug saying that he had to step out, but he plans on using your book for his class.
Oh,
So I
great.
feel like this book is very, very well placed for a class, which is probably why we have so many fantastic academics in the room, right? So it's been great to have y'all. And yeah, Chevalier is honored to have you. And we actually think Bert stepped in a little bit, so both of our owners got to see a little bit of your talk tonight. For anybody who wasn't able to make it, I've been recording, so I will be posting it onto our YouTube channel, and then you can share that link with anybody who wasn't able to make it.
Thank you so much.
Great.
And thank you all
Yeah.
for coming.
Thanks
Thank you.
Yeah.
to
Thank
Jon
you,
Wiener
Brad.
too, the great.
Thank you, Jon. Yes.
Total pleasure. Total
And
pleasure.
thank you,
Honored to be here. Yes. Read John's book too about
Oh
LA
my gosh,
in
you
the
have it?
60s. It's a really great book. And I literally happen to have it on my
And I
desk.
have a too, John, by the way. I bought a copy.
You guys are great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Bye.
night.